In February of 1951, in a New York hospital room, an 80-year-old woman died, and when her lawyers went looking for her will, they found it folded inside a tin cabinet stacked between cakes of soap. The document gave away almost $95 million. Almost none of it went to a relative. She was the daughter of the richest woman America had ever produced, and with a single signature, she ended the family name forever. She was not the only one. Before her, there was a mother who built a college out of grief and cut out the nephews who were waiting, a widow who handed half a fortune to her dead husband's business partner, a Scottish girl turned one of the richest women alive who struck 3 of her own grandchildren from the page. Every one of them had outlived the men. Every one of them left it to strangers. The question is why? I spend my evenings among the gilded dead, reading the wills the families wished had never been opened. If you want the whole story, all the way to the last signature, subscribe to Velvet Society and stay with me. Chapter 1. A stranger's name in a waiting room. Every great American fortune ended the same way, in a quiet room where a lawyer read a will aloud to relatives who were about to hear a name that was not their own. The furniture in that room was always expensive. The people in it were always well dressed, and they were always, underneath the mourning, doing arithmetic. They had come to learn their share. They had spent years, in some cases decades, arranging their lives around the certainty of it, and they had earned it, or believed they had. By the oldest logic there is, the logic of blood. A fortune passes down. That was the rule the whole century was built on. And then the lawyer would begin to read, and somewhere in the 2nd or 3rd paragraph, the family would understand that the rule had been broken deliberately by the one person who had the power to break it, and that the money was going somewhere else. It is a small scene, repeated across the whole history of American money, and it almost never made the newspapers, because there is nothing photogenic about disappointment in a well-appointed room. But it happened, again and again, in the law offices and the drawing rooms of a country that had quietly convinced itself the rich were a kind of aristocracy whose fortunes descended in orderly lines, father to son, generation to generation, forever. The reading of a will is the moment that belief meets the truth, and the truth is colder and simpler than the belief. A fortune belongs, in the end, to whoever holds the pen last. For most of the century, that person was a man, and the orderly lines held, and the sons got what the fathers had promised them without ever having to wonder whether they would. This is the story of 4 times the person holding the pen was a woman, and of what happened to the orderly lines when she did. This is a story about 4 women who did that. 4 women who sat, at the end of long lives, on top of fortunes that the men of their families had built, and who decided, each in her own way, to send that money out of the family and into the hands of strangers. A college full of girls none of them had met, a husband's business partner, a row of hospitals, a list of 63 institutions. They did it knowing exactly who was waiting, and they did it in the one document the law would not let anyone overrule while they were sane to sign it. In every case, the waiting relatives fought back. In every case, they went to court and stood before a judge and argued that the old woman could not have meant it, that she had been mad or tricked or too weak to know her own mind. And in every case that mattered, they lost. Begin with the one whose ending was the most complete. In the winter of 1951, an 80-year-old widow named Sylvia Green Wilks lay dying in a New York hospital, and she was, though almost no one on the street would have recognized her, the last living heir to the greatest fortune ever assembled by an American woman. Her mother had been Hetty Green, the woman the newspapers called the Witch of Wall Street, the richest woman in the country, and one of the shrewdest financial minds of the age. Sylvia had inherited all of it, both halves of it, every dollar her mother had ever squeezed out of the market, and she had spent her life hiding from the world that wanted to look at it. When she died, the men who handled her affairs went to find her will. They did not find it in a vault. They found it folded inside a tin cabinet in her home, stacked in among cakes of household soap, as though a document disposing of $95 million was something to be kept dry next to the washing. They opened it, and they read it, and the shape of the thing became clear. There was a cousin, her nearest living relative, and the cousin was left $5,000. Everything else, the whole of that enormous estate, was divided among 63 colleges, churches, and hospitals. Not one of them bore the family name. Not $1 was set aside to carry the name of Green or Wilks into the next generation, because there would be no next generation. And Sylvia had arranged the papers so that the fortune would scatter into 100 institutions the moment she was gone. The richest woman in America had raised a daughter who spent that daughter's own death erasing the family from the record. She left it to strangers. That is the image to hold, because everything that follows is a variation on it. The will read aloud, the relatives doing their arithmetic, the moment the arithmetic collapses. And underneath all of it, the single act that made it possible, one woman, alone, putting a pen to a piece of paper and deciding where a fortune would go. That signature is the thread through this entire story. It is worth understanding how strange it was that these women had it, because for most of their lives they had almost no power of any other kind at all. They had been daughters, and then wives, and then widows, and at nearly every stage the money had been controlled by someone else: a father, a husband, a trustee, a son. The one thing the law of the age handed a woman, absolutely and without appeal, was the right to write her own will. It was often the first uncontested decision of her life. For several of these women, it was the last and the only. They did not know one another. They were born decades apart, in different cities, into different kinds of money, grocery money and Wall Street money, and department store money and automobile money. What binds them is not acquaintance, but pattern. The same door opening at the end of 4 different lives, and the same choice made when it opened. Each of them had outlived the men. The husbands who built the fortunes died first, and often died young. The brothers who were supposed to inherit died, or drank it away, or simply predeceased. The sons burned through what they were given, and the daughters and the widows, the women, lasted. They lasted into their 80s, their 90s, past 100 by the newspaper's generous count, until they were the only ones left standing over the money, with a pen in one hand and a family in the waiting room. What they did with that moment is the subject of this film, and the order in which it tells their stories is deliberate. It climbs. It begins with the gentlest of them, a grieving mother whose motive was love, and it ends with the most complete erasure of all, a recluse who wiped out a name. In between are a widow who gave half a great fortune to a man who was no relation to her at all, and a poor girl from Scotland who became one of the wealthiest women in the world, and then, at the very end, took a pen to her own grandchildren. 4 women, 4 fortunes, 4 rooms full of people who did not get what they were waiting for, and one question that hangs over all of them, and that the courts spent years failing to answer, which is whether a woman who leaves her millions to strangers has betrayed her family, or has simply, for once, been allowed to choose. Chapter 2. Why the money outlived the men. The men who built these fortunes died first, and they died sure the money would pass the way it always had, from father to son. That certainty was not arrogance. It was the plain expectation of the age, encoded in law, in custom, and in the architecture of every great family. A man made a fortune so that his name would outlast him, and the vehicle for that survival was his male line. He built the house for the son. He wrote the will for the son. He assumed, because everyone assumed it, that his widow would be a caretaker of the fortune for a few quiet years and then hand it on intact to the boy who carried the name. What none of them planned for, because the arithmetic of death is not something the confident like to dwell on, was the possibility that they would all be gone, the sons and the brothers and the heirs, and that the last one left holding the money would be a woman. But that is what happened, again and again, and it happened for reasons that were almost mechanical. Consider the demography of a Gilded Age fortune. The man who built it was usually older than his wife, often much older, and he had worked himself hard doing it, so he tended to die first, sometimes decades first. The sons, raised in the softness the father's money bought, were a poor bet to outlast anyone. Some drank, some gambled. Some spent their inheritances on yachts and chorus girls and bad investments, and simply exhausted the money before it could do them any harm. And some, through nothing but chance, died young, of illness or accident, before their mothers did. What remained, standing at the end over the whole accumulated pile, was disproportionately the wife, the widow, the daughter who never married, the woman the founder had counted on only to keep the seat warm. And here the law did something it had never intended to do. It handed her a weapon. For most of her life, a woman of this class had been legally and financially furnished with almost nothing of her own. Under the old rules of coverture, a married woman's property had belonged, in practice and often in law, to her husband. She lived on an allowance doled out by a man, and the size of that allowance had nothing to do with the size of the fortune it came from. There were women in this story who slept in houses worth millions and were made to account for the cost of the candles. They owned everything and controlled nothing. Their wealth was a fact about their husbands, not about themselves. But a widow with clear title, or a spinster who had inherited outright, stood in a different position entirely, because the one power the law never qualified, never means tested, never handed to a man to exercise on her behalf, was the power to say where her money went when she died. That power was the will, and it is the mechanism at the center of every story here. So it is worth being precise about what it could and could not do. A sane adult with clear title to her property could leave that property to anyone she liked. She could leave it to a college, to a church, to a hospital, to a servant, to a business partner, to a cat. She did not have to explain herself. She did not have to be fair. She did not have to leave a single dollar to the people whose blood ran in her veins. And if she chose to cut them out, the law would enforce her choice against them, provided only that she had been of sound mind when she signed. That proviso is the hinge on which all the courtroom drama in this film turns, because it gave the cutout family exactly one line of attack. They could not argue that the will was unfair. Unfairness was allowed. They could only argue that she had not really meant it, that her mind had gone, or that some scheming stranger had reached in and moved her hand. This is the origin of the American will contest, and by the turn of the century, it had become a genre unto itself, with its own vocabulary and its own grim theatre. The two magic phrases were unsound mind and undue influence. Unsound mind meant she was too old, too ill, too addled to know what she was doing. Undue influence meant someone had gotten to her, a nurse, a companion, a lawyer, a favourite, and bent her will to theirs. To prove either, the family would drag the most private facts of a dead woman's life into open court, her habits, her illnesses, her eccentricities, the state of her housekeeping, the company she kept. A woman who had spent her whole life avoiding exposure would find, after death, that her relatives were prepared to describe her as a lunatic in front of a judge if it might return the money to the bloodline. The will was the woman's last weapon. The contest was the family's answer to it. Against that backdrop, one more thing had changed by the late 19th century, and it changed where the money could go. This was the dawn of the Great American Foundation and the Great American Endowment. For the first time, there existed institutions built to receive enormous private gifts and to turn them into something permanent. Universities hungry for buildings, hospitals hungry for wings, brand new colleges founded specifically to educate women, and a whole new idea, the charitable foundation, designed to hold a fortune and spend its income forever. A childless heiress in 1850 had nowhere obvious to send a fortune except the family. A childless heiress in 1910 had a catalogue of institutions competing for it. When these women reached for somewhere to put the money other than the relatives, that somewhere was waiting, marble and eager, with a name ready to carve over the door. This was the age that gave the country the phrase, the gospel of wealth, the idea, preached by the richest men of the era, that a great fortune was a public trust, and that the man who died rich died disgraced. The men who preached it mostly meant it as a way of shaping their own legacies, and most of them kept a firm grip on the money while they were alive to enjoy it. But the idea was in the air, respectable, and even admired, and it handed a childless woman with a fortune and a grievance a language for exactly what she was about to do. She was not abandoning her family. She was answering a higher call. The strangers she chose were not really strangers at all. They were the public, and the public, the gospel said, was the worthier heir. Not every woman of the age used the weapon against her own blood. The most famous of them did the opposite, and she is worth a sentence here precisely because she is the exception that shows the rule. Margaret Olivia Slocum Sage inherited roughly $70 million from her miserly husband, the financier Russell Sage, and she spent the rest of her life giving it away to colleges and to the foundation that still carries his name. But when she died, she took care of her own. Her brother received $8 million and helped administer the estate, and no relative sued her, because no relative had been cut out. She gave a robber baron's fortune to strangers, and she did it without ever making an enemy of her family, which is exactly why almost no one tells her story as a scandal. The women in this film are remembered differently because they did the harder and colder thing. They kept the strangers and cut the family. And the first of them did it not out of spite, but out of grief. Chapter 3. The daughter she could not keep. Josephine Newcomb was a widow with one child left in the world when diphtheria took her daughter Sophie at 15. That single sentence holds the whole engine of her story, and everything she later did with her fortune. Every dollar she moved away from the people who expected it runs back to the winter that sentence describes. She had already buried a husband. She had already learned what the age taught every woman sooner or later, that the security of her whole life rested on the continued breathing of other people, and that she had almost no control over whether they kept breathing. When the diphtheria came for Sophie, it took the last person Josephine Newcomb had, and it left her a wealthy woman with no one to be wealthy for. She had been born in Baltimore in 1816, and she had married Warren Newcomb, a merchant who made his money in the wholesale grocery trade between New Orleans and New York. It was solid money, the money of ledgers and warehouses and long credit, not the flashing, speculative fortune of the railroad men, but it was real, and it grew. Warren died in 1866, and here Josephine did something that already set her apart from most widows of her generation. She did not hand the business to a male relative to manage. She took hold of the fortune herself, and she managed it. And under her hand, it did not shrink. It grew. A woman running her own capital in the 1870s was rare enough to be remarkable, and Josephine Newcomb was demonstrably good at it. Whatever else the world would later say about her mind, the record of those years says she was a competent and careful steward of her own money for decades, which makes the later accusations of madness worth remembering with some skepticism. The fortune itself had come out of the least glamorous corner of the American economy, the wholesale grocery and commission trade, the business of moving flour and sugar and coffee and dry goods in bulk between the great port of New Orleans and the markets of New York. It was not a business that made headlines or built marble palaces, but it was steady and it was large, and it rewarded exactly the qualities Josephine possessed: patience, attention, and a refusal to be cheated. Warren Newcomb had built it across decades of ledgers and long credit, and when he died in 1866, he left it to a widow who understood it better than most of the men who might have taken it off her hands. She kept the accounts herself. She watched the markets. She made the decisions a widow of her class was expected to hand to a brother or a lawyer, and she made them well enough that the fortune she would one day give away was larger than the one she had inherited. But no ledger could give her back the thing she had actually lost. Sophie had been the point of all of it, the daughter for whom a fortune is kept and grown, and Sophie was gone, and the arithmetic of Josephine's life after 1870 never balanced again. She was a woman with a great deal of money and no one to spend a future on, and she spent 16 years turning that emptiness over before she settled on the answer. The length of the deliberation is the measure of the woman. This was not grief acting on impulse in a single weak season. It was grief refined into a plan, tested and retested across a decade and a half of solitary evenings, until it hardened into the single idea that would define her, that if she could not have her daughter, she could at least make her daughter's name into something that would teach and shelter other people's daughters for as long as the money lasted, which was to say, forever. But money, however well managed, was not the thing she had wanted it for. She had wanted it for Sophie. Harriet Sophie Newcomb was the daughter, the future, the person around whom a widow could organize a life that had otherwise lost its center. And in 1870, Sophie died at 15 of diphtheria, one of the ordinary killers of children in that century, a disease that closed a healthy throat over a matter of days and left nothing for medicine to do. There was no drama to it that the age would have called scandalous. There was only the private catastrophe, repeated in 1,000 houses every year, of a mother outliving her only child. What made Josephine Newcomb different was not the loss. It was what she decided to build on the site of it. She waited 16 years. That detail matters because it answers, in advance, one of the charges her relatives would later bring. This was not the sudden whim of a broken old woman, seized upon in a moment of weakness and steered by some interested party. It was a decision she carried and turned over and refined across 16 years of solvent widowhood. In 1886, she went to the administrators of the Tulane Educational Fund in New Orleans, the institution that would become Tulane University, and she gave them $100,000 to found a college. Not a memorial plaque, not a scholarship, a college, a degree-granting college for young women, and she attached to it one condition that told everyone what it was really for. It would carry her dead daughter's name. It would be called the Sophie Newcomb Memorial College, and it would be, in the plainest terms, a daughter rebuilt out of money. Think about what that gift actually was. A woman had lost the one person she loved, and instead of retreating into private mourning, she had reached for the only kind of permanence her fortune could buy, and used it to make her daughter's name into a living thing. Every young woman who enrolled would speak the name Sophie Newcomb. Every diploma would carry it. The name that had belonged to a 15-year-old girl for 15 years would now belong to an institution that might, and did, outlast everyone then living. It was one of the first colleges of its kind in the country, a women's college bound to a university, and it became a real and respected place, known in time for its art and its pottery, and the generations of women it educated. Josephine Newcomb had converted grief into an institution, and the institution worked. And here is the part that turns her from a philanthropist into one of the women in this film. The money she poured into the college, and it grew, over her life and in her will, to a total of roughly $3.5 million, was money that had to come from somewhere, and it came from the place a fortune usually goes. It came from the inheritance. Josephine Newcomb had relatives. She had a network of nephews and nieces, the Henderson family, the collateral kin, who, in the ordinary course of things, would have expected to divide the estate of a childless widow among themselves. She was not childless by choice. She was childless because her child had died. But the law did not distinguish between the two, and neither, in the end, did the relatives. As far as they were concerned, Aunt Josephine was a rich old woman with no children, and rich old women with no children left their money to the family. She had other plans, and she had had them for a long time, and she had written them down. Somewhere in those years of solitary stewardship, Josephine Newcomb decided that the fortune Warren had built and she had grown would not go to the Hendersons. It would go to Sophie, or to the closest thing to Sophie that money could make, which was the college that bore her name. The nephews and nieces would receive, in the final accounting, effectively nothing of consequence. And Josephine, who had spent 16 years deciding this, and who had every legal right to decide it, went to her grave in 1901 believing the matter was settled. It was not settled. The reading of the will was still to come, and in the waiting room, the Hendersons were already doing their arithmetic. Chapter 4. The Nephews Who Called Her Mad. When Josephine died in 1901, the relatives who had expected the estate read the will and went to court. They did not go quietly, and they did not go quickly. What followed was a legal campaign that lasted the better part of a decade, and it was fought on exactly the two lines of attack the law allowed, because they were the only two available. The Hendersons could not say that Josephine Newcomb had been unfair, because unfairness was her right. So they said instead that she had been mad, and that she had been manipulated. They said she was of unsound mind, an old woman whose judgment had failed her. And they said she was under undue influence, that the people around the college had reached into a grieving widow's confusion and steered her fortune toward themselves. Between them, those two claims were an attempt to erase 16 years of deliberate decision and replace it with the picture of a feeble dupe. To make that picture stick, the Hendersons needed the law of the right state on their side. And so a great deal of the fight came down to a question that sounds like a technicality, and was in fact the whole battle. Josephine had written her will out by hand, in her own writing, a form the lawyers call a holographic will, and such a document was treated very differently depending on where the woman who wrote it had legally lived. If her true home had been Louisiana, with its old French inheritance law, the handwritten will stood on ground so firm that the family's challenge withered. If her home had been New York, the door to a fight over undue influence opened wider. So the relatives argued, with everything they had, that their aunt had really been a New Yorker, and the estate argued the opposite, and the ownership of several $1 million turned on the address of a dead woman. The fight ground through the courts for years. It began in the surrogate's court, the tribunal that handles the estates of the dead. And it did not end there. The Hendersons appealed and appealed again, and the litigation ran on so long that by the time it reached its conclusion, Josephine Newcomb had been dead the better part of a decade. What the family spent on lawyers across those years is not recorded, but it was the kind of sum only the hope of a fortune could justify, poured into the single argument that a competent woman had not been competent after all. And at the end of it, in 1908, the highest court in New York, the Court of Appeals, closed the matter for good. It ruled against the family, and it did so in a decision that turned on exactly that dry question of where Josephine had lived, a ruling so useful on the law of a person's legal home that lawyers went on citing it long after everyone involved was dead and the money was spent. The record made that a hard picture to sell. Here was a woman who had managed a substantial fortune herself, competently, for 35 years. Here was a gift she had first made in 1886 and reaffirmed and enlarged across the rest of her life. Not a deathbed scrawl, but a settled and repeated intention. To call that the product of an unsound mind, the family had to argue that a woman could be sane enough to grow a fortune for decades, and insane only at the precise moments she directed it away from them, which is the kind of argument that persuades people who badly want to be persuaded and very few others. But the Hendersons were not relying on persuasion alone. They had a second and more technical weapon, and it turned on a question that sounds dry and was in fact the whole game. The question was where Josephine Newcomb had legally lived. It mattered enormously, because the law of one state was friendlier to the family than the law of another. Josephine had connections to New York and to Louisiana both, and she had written her will in her own hand, a form that was treated very differently depending on the jurisdiction. In one reading, if her true legal home was New York, the door to an undue influence challenge stood wider open. In another, if she was domiciled in Louisiana, the handwritten will stood on far firmer ground, and the family's case largely collapsed. So the contest became, in large part, a fight over a dead woman's address, litigated with the ferocity that only a fortune can buy, through court after court, as the Hendersons pressed the claim that their aunt had been both incompetent and improperly housed under the wrong state's law. They lost. They lost at the first level, in the surrogates court that handles the estates of the dead. They lost on appeal. And in 1908, 7 years after Josephine Newcomb's death, they lost, finally and conclusively, in the highest court of New York, the Court of Appeals, in a decision that lawyers still cite, because the fight over where she had lived turned out to make useful law on the whole question of domicile. The college kept the money. Every dollar Josephine had directed toward the institution that carried her daughter's name stayed with the institution. The Hendersons, who had spent 7 years and a great deal of their own money arguing that the old woman had been out of her mind, walked away with the ruling against them and the family name conspicuously absent from anything the fortune had built. Stand back from the courtroom and look at what the fight had actually been about, because it sets the pattern for everything still to come in this story. A woman had made a choice. She had made it slowly, in full possession of her faculties, over 16 years, and she had made it for the most human reason imaginable, because a child she loved had died and she wanted the child's name to live. The family's response was not to accept the choice. It was to attack the chooser, to stand up in open court and describe a competent, deliberate woman as a lunatic, because that was the only route back to the money. And the law, in this case, held the line. It said, in effect, that a sane woman's decision about her own fortune would be honored even against her blood, even when her blood was willing to call her insane to break it. There is one detail that collapses the whole of Josephine Newcomb's story into a single image, and it is not in the courtroom. It is carved in stone. Somewhere in New Orleans, on the buildings of the college she founded, is the name of a girl who died at 15 in 1870, spelled out and set in stone and spoken aloud by young women who have no idea who she was. That is what the $3.5 million bought. Not a dynasty, not an heir, a name, rescued from a child's grave and fixed to an institution, so that the one thing the diphtheria could not be allowed to take, the fact of Sophie Newcomb having existed, would go on being true after everyone who had grieved her was also gone. Josephine had no descendants to carry her forward, so she built a college to do it instead, and she defended that choice through her lawyers from beyond the grave, and she won. But Josephine Newcomb, for all the ferocity of the fight she left behind her, had done the gentlest version of the thing this film is about. She had given her fortune to a memory, to a dead daughter's name, and the strangers who benefited were young women she would have recognized as worthy of it. The motive was love, and the sum, by the standards of the giants of the age, was modest, a few $1 million fought over in a New Orleans college. The next woman in this story did something colder and larger. She sat on a fortune 10 times the size, one of the greatest commercial fortunes in the country, and when she came to dispose of it, she passed over her own blood entirely and handed half of it to a man who was no relation to her at all. And before she died, the age gave her a warning of what happens to a fortune left in the wrong hands. A warning delivered in the most literal way imaginable, when someone crept into a churchyard in the dark and stole her dead husband out of his grave. Chapter 5. The Merchant Prince's Childless Widow. Cornelia Clinch married the man who invented the American department store and buried both of their children before either learned to speak. She was born Cornelia Mitchell Clinch in 1802 into a New York family of shipbuilders and hardware merchants, respectable and comfortable and utterly conventional. In 1823, she married a young Irish immigrant named Alexander Stewart, and there was nothing in that wedding to suggest that she was marrying one of the great commercial minds the country would produce. He was a shopkeeper. He sold dry goods, lace and linen and cloth, out of a modest premises in Lower Manhattan. What no one at the wedding could have known was that this quiet, exacting Irishman was about to reinvent the way America bought and sold, and make, in the process, one of the largest fortunes on the continent. Alexander Stewart's genius was for scale and system. In 1846, he opened a store on Broadway so grand that the city named it the Marble Palace, a retail cathedral of white marble that treated the ordinary act of shopping as an experience worth architecture. It was unlike anything the country had seen, and it worked. He followed it in 1862 with an even larger building, the Iron Palace, a cast-iron colossus that covered a full block and employed a small army of clerks. He standardized prices. He bought in volumes that let him undercut every rival. He built a network of mills and suppliers that fed the stores, and he grew, from a shopkeeper, into the merchant prince of New York, until his fortune was reckoned among the largest in the United States, somewhere between $30 and $40 million, a sum that in that century made him one of the richest men alive. To grasp what that fortune meant, set it against the world it was made in. In the years after the Civil War, when a comfortable family lived well on a few $1,000s a year, Alexander Stewart was worth tens of millions, and his stores took in sums in a single day that would have been a lifetime's wealth to the clerks who worked in them. He employed thousands. He owned mills that fed the shelves, ships that carried the goods, and blocks of Manhattan real estate that grew more valuable while he slept. He reached, near the end of his life, for for the kind of monument the very rich of that age could not resist. A whole planned town laid out on the empty plains of Long Island. A model community he called Garden City, meant to embody orderly and healthful living the way his stores embodied orderly and abundant buying. He did not live to finish it. Like so many of the builders in this story, he ran out of time before he ran out of ambition, and the finishing of his monuments fell to the widow he left behind. And through the whole of that ascent, more than 50 years of it, Cornelia had been beside him, the constant and private partner of a very public fortune. Theirs was not a marriage the newspapers wrote about, because there was nothing scandalous in it to write. It was long, and it was faithful, and it was childless in the way that mattered most, because the children who might have carried it forward had died before they could speak. 50 years of marriage, 2 small graves, and a fortune with no one at the end of it to inherit. That was the arithmetic Cornelia was left to solve when the merchant prince finally died and left the whole of it in her hands. And through all of it, at his side, was Cornelia. Theirs was a long marriage, more than 50 years of it, and by every account, a genuinely close one, 2 disciplined and private people who preferred each other's company to society's. They had wealth beyond spending and a partnership that held. What they did not have, what they were never allowed to keep, was a family. Cornelia bore children, a son in 1834 and a daughter a few years after, and both of them died in infancy, in the ordinary catastrophic way that infants died in that century, of fevers and failures that no amount of money could reach. The richest household in New York could buy marble by the block and could not keep a child alive past its first years. After the second small grave, there were no more. Cornelia Clinch Stewart would live out a very long life as the childless wife, and then the childless widow, of a man whose entire enterprise had been built, like every enterprise of the age, on the unspoken assumption that there would be someone to leave it to. There was not. And that single fact, the absence at the center of all that abundance, is what makes Cornelia one of the women in this story. Alexander Stewart had built an empire with no heir to receive it. He had a wife, whom he trusted completely, and he had a business partner and general of his affairs, a lawyer named Henry Hilton, whom he also trusted. And he had a swarm of distant Irish relations he had left behind decades before and largely ignored. When he died in 1876, he left almost everything to Cornelia. The great fortune, the stores, the real estate, the model town he had begun to build out on the Long Island plains, a planned community he called Garden City, meant to be a monument to orderly living. All of it passed to a 74-year-old childless widow, who now sat alone atop one of the largest commercial fortunes in America with no obvious idea, and no living child, to leave it to. Consider the position she was in, because it is the position at the heart of this entire film, arrived at from a different direction each time. A woman of enormous wealth and advanced age, with the whole fortune in her own hands at last, and no descendant to receive it. The money that Alexander Stewart had spent 50 years accumulating had reached, at the end of the line, a dead end, and the person standing at that dead end was his widow. Everything now depended on what she would decide, and on whom she would trust to help her decide it. She was old. She was grieving a husband after half a century of marriage. She was, in the way of women of her class and time, unpracticed in the exercise of raw financial power, having spent her life beside a man who exercised it for both of them. Into that vacuum stepped the one figure Alexander Stewart had trained her to rely on, the partner who had run the empire's affairs, Henry Hilton. And the fortune began, quietly, to flow toward him. Before it could finish flowing, the age delivered its warning, and it delivered it in a form so grotesque that it reads like invention. In 1878, 2 years after Alexander Stewart was laid to rest in the churchyard of St. Mark's Church in the Bowery, someone opened his grave in the night and stole his body. The most famous merchant in America, dead and buried, was simply removed from the earth by unknown men, and a demand for ransom followed, a demand for a large sum of money in exchange for the return of the remains. The city was scandalized. The theft of a rich man's corpse for money was the kind of crime that seemed to say something about the age itself, about a country where even the dead were now assets to be seized and monetized, and the newspapers covered every turn of it. A reward was offered. Negotiations, murky and disputed, dragged on, and eventually, by an account that has never been fully clarified, a payment was made, and a set of remains was returned to the family. The eerie thing about the episode is not the crime itself, but its timing and its symbolism, and both should be handed to the viewer honestly rather than dressed up. The grounded explanation is the obvious one. Grave robbing for ransom was a real, if rare, crime in that century, and Alexander Stewart was an almost irresistible target, one of the most famous and wealthiest men in the country, buried in an accessible city churchyard. The motive was money, plainly, and the resolution was money, plainly. There is no need to reach for a curse, and yet the shape of it is hard to ignore, because at the very moment Cornelia Stewart was deciding what would happen to her husband's fortune, someone reached into her husband's grave and turned his body into a hostage. The man himself had become, in death, exactly what his money was about to become. Something valuable, unprotected, and carried off by people to whom he was no relation at all. Chapter 6. The partner who inherited the empire. 2 years after Alexander Stewart was buried, someone dug his body out of the churchyard and demanded a ransom for his bones, and it fell to Cornelia and to Henry Hilton to answer the demand. That detail tells you who was standing closest to the fortune in Cornelia's last years. Not a son, because there was no son. Not a nephew of her own blood raised into the business, because there was none of those either. It was Hilton, the lawyer and partner, the man Alexander Stewart had trusted to run his affairs. And after Alexander's death, Hilton did not merely advise the widow. He effectively took command of the empire. He ran the stores. He managed the estate. He stood between Cornelia and the machinery of the fortune, and he did it with the authority of the dead man's confidence behind him. What Hilton did with that authority became, over the following years, one of the cautionary tales of American commerce. He was not the merchant Alexander Stewart had been, and the empire suffered for it. Under his management, the great retail business that had been the wonder of the age began to decline, losing its customers, its prestige, and its value. Until in time, the famous stores passed out of the family's hands entirely, and the Stewart name, which had blazed over Broadway in marble and iron, faded from the storefronts. The man who had built the most modern retail operation in the country had left it to a widow who had left its running to a partner, who ran it into the ground. The fortune did not vanish overnight, but the enterprise that had generated it was hollowed out, and the name went with it. The details of that decline read like a lesson in how not to inherit a business. Henry Hilton had been a lawyer and a fixer, a useful man in a supporting role, and he had no instinct for the thing Alexander Stewart had been a genius at, which was retail itself, the daily judgment of what people would buy and at what price. Under him, the great emporiums lost the loyalty of the customers who had made them, drifted, and shed value year over year, until the business that had once been the wonder of Broadway was sold off, and its most famous store eventually passed to a rival merchant, John Wanamaker, whose name rose where Stewart's had come down. A fortune built by one of the sharpest commercial minds of the century became, within a generation of his death, a byword for squandered inheritance, and the man who squandered it was the stranger his widow had trusted with half of everything. The reading of Cornelia's will in 1886 laid the choice bare. After the legacies to her own Clinch relations, the residue was split, and the largest single beneficiary of the whole arrangement was not a Stewart, and in the end, not even a blood relation of Cornelia's own, but Judge Henry Hilton, the partner, the outsider, the man already in possession of the machinery. Half of one of the largest fortunes in the United States passed to him by the deliberate act of the childless widow, and the passing of it drew, as these fortunes always drew, the claimants out of the shadows. From the Irish past of Alexander Stewart came a scattering of distant relations, the tourney kin, arguing that the blood of the man who built the money deserved a portion of it. Their claims were heard, and their claims were denied. They had dissent and nothing more, no place in the will and no standing the courts would honour, and they went away empty while the stranger kept his half. It was the starkest demonstration yet of the rule that governs this entire story. Blood expected the money, and the law followed the signature. And the signature, in Cornelia's case, had followed her husband's trust rather than her own judgment, which is why hers is the cautionary version of the freedom this film describes, a fortune sent out of the blood not in triumph, but in error. And then Cornelia died in 1886, and her will was read, and the shape of her choice became clear. After legacies to her own Clinch relations, the residue of the great Stewart fortune, the accumulated wealth of the merchant prince, was divided, and half of it went to Henry Hilton. Not to a Stewart, not to a child, because there was no child, not even in whole to her own Clinch blood. Half of one of the largest fortunes in the United States went to a man who was no relation to Cornelia Stewart at all, her dead husband's business partner, the general of the empire, the stranger at the centre of the household. The other half she left to a kinsman of her own, Charles Clinch. But it is the Hilton half that makes her story what it is, because it was the clearest case yet of the pattern this film traces. The blood, such as it was, got a portion. The stranger got half. The reading of that will produce exactly the scene this story keeps returning to, the waiting relatives and the collapsing arithmetic. And in Cornelia's case, the relatives came from an unexpected quarter. Out of the distant past, out of the Irish villages Alexander Stewart had left as a young man, came a swarm of claimants, tourney relations, distant kin of the dead merchant who surfaced now that the fortune was in play and argued that they, the blood of the man who had actually built it, deserved a share. They were, in the language of the age, long-lost relatives, and the fortune drew them the way fortunes always draw them, out of the woodwork and into court. Their claims were heard, and their claims were dismissed. They had no standing that the law would recognize against the widow's will and the husband's own arrangements. They had blood, and nothing else. And blood, it turned out, was not enough. They went away with nothing, and the money stayed where Cornelia and Alexander had directed it, half of it in the hands of a stranger. There is a bleak lesson buried in the years that followed, and it complicates the easy version of these stories. Leaving a fortune to a stranger is not always a triumph of free choice over grasping relatives. Sometimes the stranger is simply the wrong person, and the fortune suffers for it. Henry Hilton was no worthier a steward of the Stewart millions than the tourney relations might have been, and arguably a good deal less worthy, because he had the fortune and diminished it, presided over the decline of the empire, and attached his own name to the memory of mismanagement. Cornelia had not cut out a grasping family in favor of a noble cause. She had followed her husband's trust in a man who did not deserve it, and the result was that a great commercial fortune, built with genius over half a century, was in significant part handed to someone who lacked the capacity to keep it. The freedom to choose is only as good as the choice. Collapse Cornelia Stewart's story into a single image, and it is not the marble store or the stolen body. It is the name coming down off the building. Picture the great Broadway emporium that had once been the Marble Palace, the wonder of the age, and picture the Stewart name being taken off it as the business passed to other hands. The letters that had meant the richest merchant in America simply removed, until a shopper on Broadway would have no reason to know that a fortune of $40 million had ever been made on that spot. That is what the empire came to. The man was stolen from his grave. The name was stripped from his store, and the fortune he had built was divided, at his childless widow's direction, with half of it going to the partner who let the enterprise die. Cornelia had outlived her husband, her children, and in a sense the empire itself, and at the end she gave it to a stranger by trust rather than by spite. The next woman did it by choice, and with her eyes wide open. Cornelia Stewart lost her fortune to a stranger because she trusted the wrong man to keep it in the family's spirit. But the widow who comes next did not lose anything to anyone. She was one of the richest women in the world, sharp and clear-headed into extreme old age. And when she sat down to decide the fate of a fortune of more than $100 million, she did not hand it off to a partner or drift into anyone's influence. She looked at her own grandchildren, 7 of them, the living blood of her line, and she chose deliberately to cut 3 of them out. Chapter 7. From a lunch pail to the largest yacht afloat. Anna Thomson was a poor Scottish girl who taught piano to feed her widowed mother and married a machinist named Horace Dodge. Nothing in the first 30 years of her life pointed at a French chateau, a private yacht longer than a city block, or a fortune counted in the hundreds of millions. She was born in Dundee, in Scotland, in 1871, in a rented 2-room apartment on a working street, the daughter of a man who made rope and sails for a living. When her father died, her widowed mother took the children and did what hundreds of thousands of the poor of Britain did in that century. She crossed the ocean to America, to the growing industrial towns of the Middle West, and tried to build a life out of very little. Anna was the one who earned it. She had a real musical gift, enough that in another life she might have been a concert performer, and as a young woman in the Detroit area, she used it the only way poverty allowed, by teaching. She gave lessons on the piano and the violin, and the small money she made helped keep herself and her mother fed. This is the detail to hold on to through everything that follows, because the woman who would one day own furniture made for a Queen of France began her adult life as a music teacher, supporting a widowed parent, counting the coins that came in from other people's children. She knew, in a way that the born rich in this story never did, exactly what $1 was worth, and exactly how it felt to have too few of them. In 1896, at 25, she married Horace Elgin Dodge. He was, at the time, nobody in particular, a skilled machinist, a man good with engines and metal and the insides of machines, working for wages in the Detroit that was about to become the center of the American automobile industry. Anna married a workingman, and in the early years she lived a workingman's life. The famous line she gave, later, when all the money in the world could not make her forget it, was that the happiest days of her life were the days when she was packing Horace Dodge's lunch pail. Whether or not she said it in exactly those words, and it comes to us second-hand, burnished by retelling, it is entirely in character, and it captures the truth of where she started. A lunch pail, a machinist husband, a rented life. That was the base from which the Dodge fortune climbed. It climbed because Horace and his brother John were exactly the right men in exactly the right place. The Dodge brothers were superb machinists, and they went into business supplying parts to the young automobile makers of Detroit, including a struggling operation run by a man named Henry Ford. They took payment, in part, in shares of Ford's company, and those shares turned out to be among the best investments any American ever accidentally made. As Ford exploded into one of the great enterprises of the century, the Dodge brothers' stake exploded with it. Then they sold that stake back, for a sum in the tens of millions, and used the money to build their own cars, the Dodge automobile, which succeeded in its own right. By the second decade of the new century, the two machinists from Detroit were rich beyond any scale their younger selves could have imagined. And then, within a single year, they were both dead. In the aftermath of the great influenza pandemic that swept the world after the First World War, both Dodge brothers fell ill and died in 1920, John early in the year, and Horace at the end of it, worn down by illness and, in Horace's case, by hard living. Anna, who had married a machinist with a lunch pail, was a widow at 49, and she was one of the richest widows in the country. Horace left her his entire share of the Dodge fortune, an estate reckoned at around $59 million, and she now faced the same decision Cornelia Stewart had faced: what to do with an enormous industrial fortune, and no husband left to manage it. Anna made a very different choice than Cornelia. She did not hand it to a partner. She sold. In 1925, Anna Dodge and her sister-in-law Matilda, John's widow, sold the Dodge Brothers Company to the Wall Street banking house of Dillon, Red and Company, and the price they got is one of the astonishing numbers of the age: $146 million in cash. The largest cash transaction in the history of the country to that point. The two widows of the two machinists walked away from the sale with fortunes that placed them among the wealthiest women in the world. Anna's share came to roughly $73 million, and she put much of it into tax-free municipal bonds, the safe and quiet investment of the very rich, which threw off an income of well over $1 million a year without her having to touch the principal or take any risk at all. The girl from the two-room apartment in Dundee now had more money coming in every year, doing nothing, than most Americans would see in 100 lifetimes. The seed of all of it had been a gamble that looked, at the time, like a favor. When Horace and John Dodge agreed to supply parts to Henry Ford's young company, they took part of their payment in Ford stock, a small stake in an untested venture that most sensible men of Detroit would have declined. That stake became one of the most valuable pieces of paper in the country. When the Dodge brothers sold their Ford holdings back to Ford himself around 1919, they were paid something on the order of $25 million for it, and that was before they had sold a single share of their own automobile company. The two machinists had, almost by accident, backed the most transformative enterprise of the age at its beginning and been paid a fortune to step aside from it. Everything that followed, the palaces and the yacht and the Queen's furniture, grew from that one shrewd and lucky decision to take the strange young manufacturer's stock instead of his cash. She spent it in the way the age expected of her, on a scale that turned poverty's careful daughter into a builder of palaces. On the shore of Lake St. Clair, outside Detroit, she built a mansion called Rose Terrace, and when the first version did not satisfy her, she tore it down and built a second, a limestone chateau in the French manner, modelled on the great houses of Newport, with dozens of rooms and a music room built around a pipe organ and filled with furniture that had belonged to French royalty, pieces made for Catherine the Great of Russia and for the doomed Queen, Marie Antoinette. She commissioned a yacht, the Delphine, named for her daughter. And it was for a time the largest private yacht in the world, longer than a city block, with its own pipe organ and a crew of dozens. She had strands of pearls that had once belonged to Catherine the Great, hundreds of pearls strung across several ropes. The machinist's widow had become, in the space of a few years, one of the great collectors and builders of the American century. The second Rose Terrace, the one she built to replace the house that no longer satisfied her, was a statement of arrival on the grandest possible scale. She hired the architect, Horace Trumbauer, who had built for the richest families in the country, and she leaned on the art dealer Joseph Duveen, the man who moved the treasures of ruined European aristocrats into the hands of American millionaires, to fill it. The result was a limestone chateau of some 75 rooms on the shore of the lake, with a music room built around a pipe organ, hung with paintings and furnished with pieces that had belonged to Catherine the Great of Russia and to Marie Antoinette of France. The yacht she named for her daughter, the Delphine, ran to more than 250 feet, the largest private yacht in the world at its launching, with its own organ and a crew of dozens. Even her pearls carried a pedigree, hundreds of them strung on ropes that were said to have belonged to a Russian empress. The girl who had once counted the coins from piano lessons now owned the scattered furniture of dead European courts. But the palaces and the pearls are the second story, as they always are in these lives. The first story is the family, and the family, for all the money, was already breaking. Anna Dodge had 2 children, and the fortune that had lifted her out of Dundee poverty would prove, in the end, powerless to save either of them or to hold the next generation together. The largest fortune in this film was about to run into the one thing it could not buy, which was a child who could carry it. And the failure of that child is the wound at the center of the coldest will in this story. Chapter 8. The son she could not save. Anna outlived both of her children, and the one who lived longest spent his whole life spending her money. Her daughter came first, in the order of the family and in the order of loss. Delphine Dodge, the daughter the great yacht was named for, was a spirited and gifted woman, a champion powerboat racer at a time when that was a startling thing for a woman to be, someone who lived hard and fast in the way the money made possible. She married more than once, and she did not make old bones. Delphine died in 1943, of causes tied to hard living and drink, and with her death, Anna lost her daughter, and the family lost the steadier of its 2 heirs. Delphine had been, in her way, the most vivid of the Dodges, a woman who took the family's money and its appetite for engines and turned them into a kind of fame. She raced powerboats, and she raced them well, competing and winning at the highest level of a dangerous sport, at a time when the sight of a young heiress at the wheel of a racing hull was a genuine astonishment. The great yacht carried her name. She married more than once, and she lived at the pace the fortune allowed, hard and fast, and with very little break, and the same appetite that made her thrilling to watch wore her out early. When she died in 1943, well short of old age, her mother lost not only a daughter, but the one child who might plausibly have carried the family forward with any steadiness at all. What remained was the son, and the son was a slower kind of tragedy. What remained, as the carrier of the Dodge name into the future, was Anna's son, and the son was a tragedy that money wrote in slow motion. Horace Dodge, the younger, had been born into wealth the way his mother had been born into poverty, completely and from the first breath, and it did to him what it so often did to the sons in these stories. He grew up with no limit he could feel, and no work he was required to do, and he spent his life proving that a large enough fortune can be a kind of slow poison. He married 5 times. He ran through money at a rate that alarmed even a family with hundreds of millions of it. He was chronically, spectacularly in debt, and the person who paid the debts, again and again, across decades, was his mother. Anna Dodge bankrolled her son's whole disordered life, covering his losses, funding his marriages and his divorces, keeping him afloat, and watching, year after year, as the boy she might have hoped would carry the family forward instead consumed everything he touched. She saw him clearly, which is the painful part. Anna was not a foolish or a blind mother. She had come up hard, and she knew the value of what her son was wasting. And she seems to have understood exactly what he was, and exactly what the money had done to him. The line she left about him has the flat clarity of a woman who had stopped hoping and started grieving in advance. If he had not been a rich man's son, she said, Horace might have been a great engineer, because he had his father's inventive genius. Read that sentence slowly, because it contains a whole theory of the family's ruin. The father's gift was real, the machinist's genius for how things worked, and it had passed to the son. And the fortune the father's gift had earned was the very thing that smothered it in the boy, gave him no reason to use it, and left him a rich man's wastrel instead of the engineer he might have been. The money that had lifted the family had hollowed out its heir. Horace the Younger died in 1963, and he died as he had lived, in debt to his mother. At his death, he owed Anna somewhere around $10.5 million, money she had advanced him over the years and would never see again, and his own estate, after a life spent atop one of the great fortunes of the country, amounted to almost nothing. A couple of $1 million, some cars, and the wreckage of 5 marriages. The last of those marriages produced the final indignity. His 5th wife, a former actress named Greg Sherwood, would spend the years after his death extracting further millions from the Dodge fortune through the courts and the pressure of a young son, drawing something on the order of $20 million out of the family before her own affairs collapsed into bankruptcy. The son had been a drain in life. In death, through his widow, he went on draining. It is a pattern this film has seen before, in the sons who never appeared on screen because they had already burned through their inheritances, and it is the quiet engine behind half the wills in this story. The fortunes were built by men of ferocious discipline, men who had known want and worked without rest, and they were inherited by children who had known neither. The discipline did not transmit, the money did. And so again and again the second generation became the solvent that dissolved the first generation's achievement, pouring away in yachts and marriages and debts what the founder had assembled across decades of self-denial. Anna Dodge had watched it happen to her own son in real time, year after year, check after check, and she had drawn from it the lesson that would shape her will. A fortune handed to someone who could not hold it destroyed both the money and the person, slowly, and every rescue only prolonged the ruin. By the time she came to write that will, she was a realist who had seen exactly what her money did to the people who had not earned it, and she meant to spend her last decision protecting the fortune from her own descendants. So take the measure of where Anna Dodge stood as she moved into her 90s, because it explains everything about the will she was going to write. She had started with nothing in Dundee and ended with more money than almost any woman alive. She had married for love, a machinist with a lunch pail, and buried him young. She had built palaces and bought Queen's furniture and launched the largest yacht in the world. And she had outlived both her children, watched her daughter drink herself to death, and watched her son waste a fortune and die owing her a sum that would have been a dynasty in itself. The family the money was supposed to serve had failed at the one task a family exists to perform. It had not carried on. What was left to Anna, as the last one standing, was a scattering of grandchildren and a fortune of more than $100 million, and the same pen every woman in this story eventually picked up. There is a single image that holds the whole of Anna Dodge's ending, and it is one of the most quietly devastating in this film. In her last years, wheelchair-bound after a fall, past 90 and nearing the end, Anna Dodge lived on inside Rose Terrace, the French chateau on the lake, surrounded by the furniture of Catherine the Great and Marie Antoinette, the pipe organ, the acres of limestone and gilt. And in the middle of all of it, in her own bedroom, she died in a plain metal hospital bed that had been wheeled in and set up among the royal furniture. The woman who owned the trappings of a French court spent her last days on an iron cot, watching an old battered television set, eating ice cream, listening to the popular music of the day, wanting, at the very end, the simple comforts of the poor Dundee girl she had never entirely stopped being. The palace was a costume. The metal bed was the woman. That was the woman who decided the fate of the largest fortune in this story, and she decided it with the clear, cold judgment of someone who had watched money destroy her own children. She was not mad. She was not manipulated. She was one of the most self-possessed old women in America, and she looked at her 7 grandchildren, the living remainder of her blood, and she did the thing that would keep the lawyers busy for more than a year after she was gone. She sorted them. She decided that some of them would inherit and some of them would not, and she wrote that decision into her will, and then she died, at 98, in the metal bed among the royal chairs, and left the reading of it to the room full of relatives who thought they knew what was coming. Chapter 9. 3 grandchildren struck from the page. When Anna Dodge died past 90, holding a fortune of more than $100 million, she left it to 4 of her 7 grandchildren and cut the other 3 out. She died in June of 1970, and the first thing the record fights about is her age, which is a small thing that opens onto a larger one. The newspapers reported that she had died at 103 years old, and the figure was repeated everywhere, because a woman who reaches 103 is a marvel, and marvels sell papers. But the figure was not true. Anna Thomson Dodge was born in 1871 and died in 1970, which made her 98, 2 months short of her 99th birthday. She had wanted to reach 100. It was a milestone she spoke of hoping for, and somewhere in the last years the age crept upward in the telling until the papers buried her at 103. The vanity was human and forgivable, but it should be corrected, because the truth is striking enough. She died at 98, sharp to the end, and there was nothing wrong with her mind. That matters, because when the will was read, the cut-out grandchildren would need there to have been something wrong with her mind, and there was not. The fortune, reported at more than $100 million, was to be divided among only 4 of the 7 grandchildren she had left behind. 3 of them received nothing like an equal share, struck out of the main distribution, passed over in favor of their cousins. And these were not distant grandchildren she barely knew. They were the children of her own dead son and her own dead daughter, the living remainder of the 2 children she had buried. She had looked at the 7 of them and drawn a line, 4 on one side and 3 on the other, and the 3 on the wrong side of that line were not prepared to accept it. They went to court, and what followed was exactly the contest this film keeps describing, run at the scale that only a 9-figure fortune can fund, more than a year of litigation, scores of lawyers, the private affairs of the Dodge family, the debts, the marriages, the drink, the loans that had never been repaid, all of it hauled into the light and argued over as the 3 cut-out grandchildren pressed for the shares they believed were theirs by blood. The mechanism was the same one the Hendersons had used against Josephine Newcomb 70 years before. If the will could not be called unfair, and it could not, Then the grandmother had to be called something else: incapable, mistaken, improperly influenced. Anything that might reopen the distribution and let the blood back in. The estate was fought over with the ferocity that always attends this much money, and it came before a probate judge in Wayne County, Michigan, named Bashara, whose job was to decide whether the old woman's decision would stand. The three who fought were her grandchildren by both of her lost children. There was Anna Ray Baker, a daughter of the dead Delphine, known in the family as Yvonne. There was Christine Cromwell, another of Delphine's line called C.C. And there was the youngest, John Francis Dodge, a boy still in his teens, the son of Horace Jr.'s fifth marriage to the former actress Greg Sherwood. These were the three Anna had passed over, and their circumstances made the passing over look less like cruelty than like foresight. Several of them were already deep in debt, entangled with creditors in exactly the way their father had been, so that any share of the fortune that reached them would in large part have flowed straight through their hands and into someone else's. One of them had already borrowed millions directly from Anna herself during her lifetime, money that was never coming back. The grandmother had watched the next generation begin to repeat the son's collapse in miniature, and she had written her will to keep the fortune clear of the path of that collapse. It stood. Judge Bashara ruled against the three grandchildren who had challenged the distribution, and the bulk of the fortune went where Anna had directed it, to the four she had chosen. The three who had been cut out stayed cut out, and the detail that gives the ruling its edge is that the cut-out grandchildren were, several of them, already deep in debt themselves, already in financial trouble that mirrored their fathers, so that the money they were fighting for would in many cases have flowed straight through their hands to their creditors. Anna, who had spent a decade watching exactly that happen to her son, may well have been protecting the fortune from a repeat of the very disaster that had defined her family's decline. She had seen where money went when it reached a Dodge who could not hold it, and she had arranged her affairs so that it would not go there again. The court agreed that she had the right. Look at what the money did instead of going to the three, because it completes the pattern. Anna Dodge did not build a single great monument to herself the way some of the others did. She founded no university, endowed no foundation in her own name. But she gave, at her death and around it, to the city that had made the family rich. Millions of dollars went toward a memorial fountain for the city of Detroit, a striking modern work by a celebrated sculptor that still stands on the city's riverfront plaza and carries the Dodge name in bronze and water. The contents of her music room, the royal furniture and the paintings went in significant part to the Detroit Institute of Arts, so that the Queen's chairs a machinist's widow had collected became the property of the public. And the rest of the great house's treasures were sold at auction in London the year after she died, scattered to collectors around the world for millions of dollars, a Louis XVI table alone bringing a small fortune. The palace itself, Rose Terrace, no one wanted. It was torn down a few years after her death, the French chateau on the lake reduced to rubble, and where the largest yacht in the world's owner had died in a metal bed, there is now nothing at all. The dispersal, when it came, was almost total. In London, the year after her death, the contents of Rose Terrace crossed the auction block at Christie's and were scattered to collectors around the world for something close to $5 million. A single French table alone bringing more than 400,000. The pearls that had belonged to a Russian empress were divided and sold and lost among strangers. The memorial fountain rose on the Detroit riverfront years later, a striking thing of bronze and moving water by a celebrated modern sculptor, and it carries the Dodge name to this day for the crowds who gather around it without any idea whose grief and whose calculation paid for it. Everything solid that Anna Dodge had assembled, the chateau, the collection, the fittings of the yacht, was turned back into money and dispersed. And the only pieces that stayed in one place were the ones she had deliberately given away to the museum and to the city, aimed, like everything else in her will, at the public rather than the blood. Collapse Anna Dodge into a single image, and it is that metal bed inside the gilded bedroom, the iron cot among the furniture of Marie Antoinette, because it says everything about the gap she lived in and the choice she made. She had all the trappings of an inheritance, and none of the thing an inheritance is for, which is someone worthy to receive it. She had queen's furniture and a son who died in debt. She had the largest yacht in the world and a daughter who drank herself to death. And when it came time to decide, she trusted the plain iron judgment of the Dundee girl over the gilded expectations of her blood, and she cut 3 of her own grandchildren out of $100 million, and the law upheld her right to do it. But even Anna Dodge, cold and clear as she was, did not go all the way. She cut out 3 grandchildren and kept 4. She scattered some of the fortune to a fountain and a museum, but she left the greater part of it to her own blood, and the Dodge name lived on through the children she chose. She drew a line through the family. She did not erase it. The last woman in this story did. She had no children at all, and no line to carry forward. And when she took up her pen at the end of a long and hidden life, she did not sort the family into worthy and unworthy. She removed the family entirely, gave a fortune of $95 million to 63 strangers, and let the greatest name in American finance die with her in a hospital bed, her will folded away in a tin cabinet among the cakes of soap. Chapter 10. Raised poor inside a great fortune. Sylvia Green was the daughter of Hetty Green, the richest woman in America, and she grew up in shuttered rooms with the lights cut off at 7:30. To understand what Sylvia did with her fortune at the end, you have to understand the fortune she was raised inside, and the woman who built it, because Sylvia's whole life was a reaction to both. Her mother was the woman the whole country knew as Hetty Green, born Henrietta Howland Robinson, whom the newspapers, who loved and loathed her in equal measure, called the Witch of Wall Street. She was the greatest female financier the country had produced, a woman who had turned an inheritance into an empire through nerve, patience, and a genius for buying when everyone else was selling. And she was, by any ordinary measure, one of the most extravagantly frugal human beings who ever lived. Hetty Green's frugality was not thrift. It was a discipline pursued to the edge of illness, and Sylvia and her brother were raised inside it. The family had millions, tens of millions, and they lived like the anxious poor. Hetty moved between cheap rooms and boarding houses to avoid establishing a legal residence that might be taxed. She wore the same black dress until it wore out. She was said to have haggled over the cost of everything, to have kept the household lights off, to have counted every small economy as a victory. The daughter of this woman, Sylvia, born in London in 1871, grew up eating plainly, dressing plainly, and learning, as the first lesson of her life, that money was a thing you accumulated and guarded and did not, under any circumstances, enjoy. She lived for a time with her mother in a cheap rooming house across the river in Hoboken, cooking and sewing to save the coins, a millionaire's daughter learning household economy the way a poor girl learns it, because it was the only way her mother knew how to live. The result was a childhood of manufactured poverty inside genuine and enormous wealth, and it marked Sylvia permanently. She absorbed the black clothes and never gave them up. She absorbed the horror of waste and the horror of exposure, because her mother's fortune made the family a target of tacksmen, of suitors, of reporters, of everyone who wanted a piece of Hetty Green's millions. Sylvia learned early that to have money on this scale was to be hunted. and that the safest thing a person could do with it was to disappear behind it. Where another heiress might have learned that wealth was a door into the world, Sylvia learned that it was a wall to hide behind. That lesson would define the second half of her life almost entirely, and it began at her mother's side, in rooms with the lights turned off. There is no shortage of legend about Hetty Green, and much of it should be handled with care, because a woman that rich and that strange attracted stories the way a fortune attracts claimants. But the documented core is strange enough. She wore black, always, and the newspapers claimed her dresses went unwashed until they wore out. She moved between cheap lodgings rather than keep a household worthy of her wealth. She was said to have haggled over the price of everything, from a railroad down to a stamp. Whatever the exaggerations, the pattern beneath them was real. A financial genius of the first order who treated every dollar spent on comfort as a dollar betrayed. She was one of the shrewdest investors of her century, a woman who made and multiplied a fortune in markets that broke most of the men around her. And she raised her 2 children to believe that the guarding of money was the highest form of virtue there was. There were 2 children to carry the Green fortune forward, Sylvia and her older brother Edward, whom the family called Ned. He was a large, genial, eccentric man. In most respects his sister's opposite, a spender where she was a hoarder, a public figure where she was a recluse, a man who indulged freely in the whole catalogue of pleasures his mother had denied herself. But the 2 of them shared the one fact that would decide the fortune's fate. Neither of them had children. Both of them married, and both of them married late. And around both marriages, Hetty had wrapped the same protective armour, the prenuptial agreement, the legal instrument that ensured no spouse could ever reach the family money. The fortune was to pass to the 2 children and no further, and the 2 children produced no one to pass it to. The clause that would decide everything was buried in the ordinary language of Hetty's estate. She left the fortune in the main, split evenly between the 2 children, and she attached to it the provision that if one of them died without children of their own, that half would pass to the other. It was a clause meant to keep the money whole and inside the blood, a mother's insurance against the fortune scattering. But read it forward, knowing what came, and it reads almost like a prophecy of the ending. 2 childless heirs, a clause that funneled the whole fortune to the survivor, and no generation beyond them to inherit. Hetty had built a mechanism to keep the money in the family, and the mechanism, working exactly as designed, delivered the entire fortune into the hands of one childless recluse, who would use it to make sure there was no family left for the money to stay in. It is one of the quiet ironies of this story that the most careful fortune builder of the age arranged, without ever meaning to, the extinction of her own line. From the beginning, then, the green line was a line with a visible end. 2 heirs, no grandchildren, and a mother who had arranged everything so that the money stayed sealed inside the family until there was no family left to seal it in. Hetty Green died in 1916, and the scale of what she left is worth stating plainly because it is the pool from which Sylvia's 95 million would eventually flow. Estimates of Hetty's fortune at her death run to around $67 million, an almost unimaginable sum for the era, and under careful management it kept growing after she was gone, climbing toward and past the round figure of 100 million that the newspapers liked to attach to her legend. She split it, in the main, between Ned and Sylvia, the 2 children, in equal halves, with the crucial provision that if one of them died without children, that half would pass to the other. It was a clause designed to keep the fortune whole and inside the blood. What Hetty could not have foreseen, or perhaps could have foreseen all too well, was that the clause would eventually funnel the entire fortune, both halves, into the hands of her strange, secretive, black-clad daughter, and that her daughter would use it to end the family Hetty had spent her life enriching. For the years after her mother's death, Sylvia occupied a peculiar position, an immensely rich woman who wanted nothing the money could obviously buy. She did not crave society. She did not build palaces in the manner of Anna Dodge or throw herself into the collecting and the spectacle. She had a husband, whom we will come to, and after his death she had the fortune and her fear of the world, and she arranged her life to keep the two of them company and let no one else in. She kept, famously, an enormous sum simply sitting in a bank, tens of millions of dollars, and she treated the fortune the way her mother had trained her to, as something to be held rather than used. But there was one crucial difference between mother and daughter, and it would only become visible at the very end, in the will. Hetty had guarded the fortune to pass it on. Sylvia, it turned out, had guarded it to give it away, to everyone in the world except the family. Before she could reach that final act, though, she had to survive the two great intrusions of her adult life, the two things that dragged her, against every instinct she had, out of hiding and into public view. The first was her marriage, arranged around a contract at her mother's insistence. The second was the death of her brother Ned, which pulled her into a courtroom and put her briefly and unforgettably on the record, in her own voice, defending the family money against a widow she despised. Between them, those two events are almost the entire visible portion of Sylvia Green's life. Everything else is silence, and black clothes, and a fortune sitting in a bank, waiting for the pen. Chapter 11. The marriage her mother priced. At 38, Sylvia married Matthew Astor Wilks, a man past 60, and only after he signed away every claim to her money. The marriage, when it finally came in 1909, was the kind of union that tells you everything about the family that arranged it. Matthew Astor Wilks was not a fortune hunter, which was rather the point. He was a great-grandson of the original John Jacob Astor, a man with a respectable fortune of his own, something on the order of $2 million, enough that he did not obviously need Sylvia's money. He was also more than 20 years her senior, a settled bachelor past 60 when he married a bride of 38. It was not a love match of the kind the age liked to celebrate. It was a suitable, sober, carefully vetted arrangement between two people of mature years and compatible backgrounds, and Hetty Green made certain it came wrapped in iron. The iron was the prenuptial agreement. Before Sylvia could marry, Hetty required Matthew Wilks to sign away any claim on the Green fortune, completely and permanently, so that not $1 of it could ever pass through the marriage to the Astor side. By some accounts, Wilks was paid a token sum, a few $1,000s, for signing, the price of formally renouncing a fortune he was marrying into but would never touch. Hetty was protecting the money the way she protected everything, and the protection worked exactly as designed. The marriage produced no children, so there was no heir to complicate the fortune's path. And when Matthew Wilks died in 1926, after 17 years of marriage, he left his own modest estate and no claim whatsoever on Sylvia's millions. She was a widow at 55, childless. And now, with her mother and her husband both gone, almost entirely alone in the world with the fortune and her fear of it. There is a detail about Matthew Wilks that captures the whole spirit of the arrangement. He was a great-grandson of the first John Jacob Astor, the fur trader and landlord who had built one of the oldest great fortunes in America, so he came to the marriage carrying a famous name and a comfortable fortune of his own, something on the order of $2 million. He was, in other words, precisely the kind of husband a careful mother could accept. A man rich enough not to need the bride's money and old enough not to be reckless with it. And still, Hetty took no chances. The prenuptial agreement she required him to sign stripped him of any claim to a single dollar of the Green fortune, and by several accounts he was paid a token sum of a few $1,000s simply for putting his name to it, the price of formally renouncing millions he was marrying beside and would never hold. It was a marriage built, from the first day, around the protection of the money from the very people it joined. What she did with that solitude was disappear into it. The death of Matthew Wilks in 1926 marks the point where Sylvia Green Wilks withdrew from the world almost completely and became the recluse the obituaries would describe. She kept several homes in the manner of the very rich, an apartment on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan, a house in Greenwich, Connecticut that she seems to have preferred, and a large property called Round Hill down on the Massachusetts coast, which she had inherited from her brother, and where she promptly shut off the access to the shore that Ned, the genial one, had allowed the public to enjoy. But she did not use these houses to live a public life. She used them to be unreachable. She dressed always in black, like her mother. She kept dogs. She watched birds. She followed the comic strips in the newspapers and clipped the coverage of herself. And she conducted her affairs through a small number of trusted agents so that she never had to face the world directly. A woman with a fortune approaching $100 million lived by choice, like a careful widow of modest means, alone with her animals and her clippings and her clothes. The houses themselves told the story of a woman arranging her life for solitude rather than for show. There was the apartment on Fifth Avenue, in the heart of the city she hid from. There was the house in Greenwich she seems to have loved best, a place to be private in. And there was Round Hill, the large coastal property in Massachusetts she had inherited from her brother Ned. And what she did there says everything about the difference between the two of them. Ned, the genial one, had opened the shore to the public and let people enjoy it. Sylvia, the moment it was hers, shut the access down, closed the gates, and returned the place to silence. Where her brother had wanted to be liked, Sylvia wanted only to be left alone, and she spent her share of one of the great fortunes of the country buying, more than anything else, the right to be unreachable. The detail that captures the strangeness of it, the one that says most about the mind Hetty Green had shaped, is the money in the bank. Sylvia kept, by the accounting done after her death, something on the order of $31 million sitting in a single personal checking account that paid no interest at all. Think about what that means. A third of an enormous fortune, parked in an account that earned nothing, doing nothing, generating not a cent of the income that even the most conservative investment would have thrown off. And she used the same account, indifferently, to pay a light bill of $1 or $2 and to move sums that could have bought a city block. One of the bankers who handled her affairs, contemplating all that idle money, said the thing that hangs over the whole family, that her mother, old Hetty, would never have let the money lie idle like that. Hetty had loved the money and made it work every hour of the day. Sylvia had inherited the fear of losing it and none of the joy of using it, and so she let a fortune sit dead in a drawer, guarded, useless, and waiting. There is something almost tragic in that idleness, set beside the mother. Hetty Green had been the most active money mind of her age, a woman who could not look at a dollar without putting it to work, who lent and bought and traded from dawn onward, and took a real delight in every point of interest she wrung from the market. Her daughter inherited the hoarding and lost the delight. Sylvia kept the money the way a frightened person keeps a secret, sealed away, spoken of to no one, earning nothing, protected from a world she was sure meant to take it. For more than 2 decades, a sum large enough to build hospitals and endow colleges simply sat in a bank drawer doing nothing for anyone, least of all for Sylvia, who took no visible pleasure from it at all. And then she died, and all at once the frozen fortune moved, and did in a single stroke the whole of the good it had refused to do for 30 years. That was the private Sylvia, the one almost no one ever saw, and she might have passed through the whole of the century as nothing but a name in a bank ledger and a rumour of a recluse, had her brother Ned not died in 1936 and left his affairs in the kind of chaos that money and a colourful life produce. Ned's death did to Sylvia what nothing else could have done. It forced her out of hiding. It put a fortune of more than $40 million in play. It brought a widow she loathed into open conflict with her, and it dragged Sylvia, the woman who had spent 30 years arranging never to be seen, into a courtroom and onto a witness stand, where a stranger was permitted to ask her questions to her face. What she said there is the only extended record of Sylvia Green speaking in her own voice, and it is worth every word because it shows exactly who was underneath the black clothes. She was, it turns out, not a frail or a broken woman at all. She was sharp, contemptuous, and entirely unimpressed by the machinery of the law that had summoned her. The recluse had not gone soft in her hiding. She had gone hard. And the fortune she was defending against her brother's widow was the same fortune she would, 15 years later, refuse to leave to a single living relative. To watch her in that courtroom is to watch a woman who cared about the money intensely, guarded it fiercely, and had already decided, though no one yet knew it, that when she was finished with it, no one in her family would get a cent. Chapter 12. The Witness Who Despised the Court. In 1937, Sylvia took the witness stand in the fight over her dead brother's estate, and what she said was written down word for word. To reach that stand, a great deal had to go wrong first, and it went wrong in the way that only the affairs of an eccentric millionaire can. Ned Green had died in 1936, and he had died, astonishingly for a man of his wealth, with his estate in disorder. He was found to have on his person a blank will form, a printed document never filled in, as though he had meant to set his affairs in order and never gotten around to the actual writing of them. Into that vacuum rushed the two forces that always rush into a rich man's unsettled estate, the widow and the blood. The widow was Mabel Harlow, a woman with a colourful past, a former dancer whom Ned had taken up with years before, and married only after his mother, Hetty, was safely dead, and could no longer forbid it. Ned had married Mabel in 1917, the year after Hetty's death, and he had married her, like everyone else in this family, behind a prenuptial agreement, one that capped what she could receive at a fixed and modest monthly sum. When Ned died with no proper will, Mabel moved fast. She had herself appointed to administer the estate in Texas, one of the several states Ned had lived in, on the theory that he had died without a will and belonged to Texas, and she reportedly claimed an enormous fee for the service. If she could establish that Ned had died intestate, without a valid will, and that he belonged to a state whose laws favoured a widow, she stood to convert her capped monthly allowance into a share of a $40 million fortune. The tax war that ran alongside the family fight was a spectacle in its own right, and it shows how enormous Ned's estate really was. Because Ned had kept homes in several states, in Texas and Florida and Massachusetts and New York. Each of those states claimed him as a legal resident, for the simple reason that whichever one owned him at death would collect a fortune in inheritance taxes. The sums were so large, some $6 million in taxes hanging on the answer, that the states went to war with one another over the estate of a single man, and the quarrel climbed all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. In 1939, the court sorted out the competing claims and handed the prize to Massachusetts. It is a measure of the Green fortune that the mere question of which state could tax one half of it was worth fighting to the highest court in the land, and that Sylvia stood at the center of it, the quiet sister, suddenly the most fought over heir in America. Sylvia was not going to allow it. The sister who hid from everything came out of hiding to fight for the family money, and she came out swinging in the only sense that mattered, with documents and lawyers. She produced a will, an old one, drawn up by Ned in 1908, years before he ever married Mabel, which left everything to their mother Hetty, or if Hetty were gone, to Sylvia herself. If that will held, Mabel's whole strategy collapsed, and the fortune passed to Sylvia as their mother's clause had always intended. And so the fight was joined, sister against widow, over more than $40 million, in a contest that turned on the validity of a decades-old will and on the deeper and stranger question of where Ned Green had actually legally lived, because he had kept homes in Texas, in Florida, in Massachusetts, and in New York, and each state wanted the enormous inheritance taxes his estate would generate. That tax question grew so tangled that it climbed all the way to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court of the United States, which in 1939 sorted out the 4 states' competing claims and awarded the tax prize to Massachusetts. But the legal machinery is not why this chapter exists. It exists because, in the course of that fight, Sylvia Green was called to testify, and a reporter wrote down what she said, and the transcript is the one place in the entire record where this silent woman speaks at length in her own voice. It does not sound like a frail recluse. It sounds like Hetty Green's daughter. Asked to state her name for the record, she snapped that they knew it already, that it had been used enough in the last 6 months, and then gave it in full, all of it, the long chain of family names, and added to the whole courtroom a verdict on the proceedings. "It seems to me," she said, "you are all very stupid." Asked where she lived, she refused to say, telling the court she did not think it necessary, and then, in a single line that captures the whole of her, she told them where they could find her instead. "You can find me," she said, "at the bank." It goes on, and it is glorious, and it is the emotional center of her entire story, because it is the only time the wall comes down and the person behind it speaks. Asked her age, she turned on the lawyer with the offended dignity of a woman who has decided the law has no rights over her at all. Did he think that a proper question, she demanded, for a strange man to ask a lady? She would not refuse to answer, she said, but she would not tell the truth either. Why should she? She was over 50. Now go ahead. When the opposing lawyer, trying to establish his own credentials, mentioned that he too was over 50, she looked at him and delivered the line flat. She said. "You look a lot older than that." And describing how she had come to find that crucial old will of Ned's, the 1908 document that would defeat the widow, she reached for an image that no invented character could improve on. "It attracted me," she said, "like a bull, because of the red paper attached to it. Read those answers again and notice what is missing from them. There is no confusion. There is no frailty. There is no sign of the wandering, biddable old woman that a family bent on breaking a will would need her to be. There is only contempt, precise and controlled, aimed at a court that had presumed to summon her and a lawyer who had presumed to question her. She gave them her name and an insult in the same breath. She refused her address and told them to look for her at the bank, which was the truest thing she said all day, because the bank was where she kept the only thing she trusted. She turned a question about her age into a lesson in manners, and turned the lawyer's own age back on him as a joke. This was a woman in full possession of a very sharp mind, defending money she had no intention of ever letting the family have, and doing it with the flat, fearless rudeness of someone who had decided long before that the world's opinion of her was worth nothing. The record of that day is the closest thing there is to Sylvia Green explaining herself, and what it explains is that she meant every cold thing she ever did with the money. Sit with that testimony, because it changes how you have to read everything else about her. This was not a woman whose mind had gone. This was not a woman who could be tricked or led or bent by an interested party. This was a sharp, contemptuous, self-possessed heiress who despised the court, guarded the money like her mother before her, and gave away nothing, not her age, not her address, not an inch of ground, to the strangers who presumed to question her. She won, in the end. The old will held in the ways that mattered. Mabel was reduced from her grand claims to a settlement of $500,000, and Sylvia inherited the bulk of her brother's fortune, more than $40 million, folding Ned's half of the Green money back together with her own. Now she held all of it, both halves, exactly as Hetty's clause had always steered it. The entire fortune of the Witch of Wall Street had come to rest in one childless, black-clad 70-year-old woman who had just proven in open court that her mind was as hard and clear as a ledger. And that is the woman, sharp to the last, in full command of herself, who sat down at some point in the years that followed and decided the fate of $95 million. No one could ever say she had not known what she was doing. She had shown the whole country, from a witness stand, precisely how well she knew it. Whatever she wrote into her will, she wrote it with her eyes open and her wits intact. And what she wrote was the most complete erasure of a family in this entire film. Chapter 13. 95 million to strangers. When Sylvia died in 1951, her lawyers found her will folded among cakes of soap and read out the names of 63 institutions and not one relative. She died in February of that year, at 80, in a New York hospital, the last of the Greens, the final holder of the fortune her mother had built and her brother had briefly shared. And when the men who handled her affairs went to find the document that would dispose of that fortune, they did not find it lodged with a bank or sealed in a vault, guarded the way $95 million might be expected to be guarded. They found it in her home, folded and tucked inside a tin cabinet, stacked in among cakes of ordinary household soap. The frugality her mother had branded into her held to the very end. The most consequential piece of paper she would ever sign, the instrument that would scatter a great American fortune across the country, had been kept dry next to the washing, as though it were worth no more careful handling than a bar of soap. They opened it, and they read it, and the shape of Sylvia Green's final decision became clear. The estate was enormous, appraised at just under $95 million, one of the largest fortunes ever to pass through the courts of New York, and Sylvia had left almost none of it to anyone who shared her blood. Her nearest living relative, a cousin, was left $5,000, a sum so small against the size of the estate that it read less as a bequest than as a statement. When the cousin objected in court, as cut-out relatives in this story always object, the award was raised to $140,000, still a rounding error against the whole. There were a scattering of other personal gifts, small in the context of the fortune, some $30-odd thousand to a longtime gardener, a similar sum to an accountant who had served her, $10,000 to the New York official Robert Moses, who is said to have promptly endorsed the check over to charity. The cousin who received $5,000 did what cut-out relatives in this story always do. She objected, taking her complaint to the court, and the estate, rather than fight over a rounding error, raised her award to $140,000, a sum that was still against $95 million. barely a whisper. It was enough to quiet the objection, and nothing more, and it left the essential fact untouched that the nearest blood relation of the richest woman's daughter had been valued in the first draft of the will at $5,000, and in the final settlement at a fraction of a single % of the estate. The message could hardly have been plainer. The family, such as it was, would be acknowledged and dismissed in the same stroke, and everything of substance would go elsewhere. For a woman who had guarded every dollar for a lifetime, it was a strikingly exact piece of accounting, generous to the world and pointed, almost surgical, toward the blood. And then there was everything else, the vast body of the fortune, tens upon tens of millions of dollars, and it went to institutions, 63 of them. That is the number that defines her will and her legacy, 63 colleges, churches, and hospitals, none of them bearing the name Green or Wilks, dividing among themselves the accumulated fortune of the Witch of Wall Street. The residue was carved into shares and parceled out to a catalogue of American institutions, and if you read the list, you read a map of a certain kind of respectable, useful, permanent America. There was money for Massachusetts General Hospital and for St. Luke's Hospital in the city of New Bedford, more than $1 million to each. There was money to the Public Library of New Bedford, well over $1 million, enough to build branch libraries that carried the family names into the neighborhoods as reading rooms rather than as a dynasty. There was a great gift, some $3 million, to the emergency fund of the New York City Fire Department. There was money for universities, for churches, for the society that protected animals, for a whole roll of hospitals and colleges and charities that had never met Sylvia Green and would now be endowed by her forever. Read the roll of them, and you read a certain idea of a useful country. Money for Massachusetts General Hospital and for St. Luke's Hospital in New Bedford, more than $1 million to each, to heal people Sylvia would never meet. Money to the Public Library of New Bedford, well over $1 million, enough to raise branch libraries in the working neighborhoods, carrying the family names over reading rooms rather than over a bank. A great gift, some $3 million, to the emergency fund of the New York City Fire Department. Money for universities and for churches, for the society that guards animals from cruelty, for a whole roll of colleges and hospitals and charities that had never heard the woman's voice and would now draw on her fortune forever. She had divided the estate into a great many shares and parcelled them out across this catalogue of institutions so that no single one of them would carry her name as a monument, and all of them together would carry the money into the future in 100 separate streams. It was the opposite of a dynasty, which gathers a fortune into one name and one line. It was a fortune deliberately broken into pieces so that the name behind it would disappear into the good it did. And there was, deliberately and completely, nothing for the family, because there was almost no family left, and Sylvia had arranged the papers to make sure the little that remained inherited nothing of consequence. This is the purest version of the act this entire film has been building toward. Josephine Newcomb left her fortune to a memory, to a dead daughter's name. Cornelia Stewart left half of hers to a stranger she had been taught to trust. Anna Dodge cut 3 grandchildren out but kept 4, and let the Dodge name live. Sylvia Green did none of these half measures. She had no children and no siblings left, and no line to carry forward. And rather than send the fortune sideways to cousins, rather than found a single grand institution in her own name to make herself immortal, she dissolved the entire fortune into 63 separate strangers and let the greatest name in American finance simply stop. The Green Line, which her mother had spent a lifetime enriching and protecting, ended with Sylvia in a hospital bed. and Sylvia had written the papers so that it would end with nothing of itself surviving but the good the money did in other people's names. There is a temptation, reading that will, to see it as cold, and colder even than Anna Dodge's sorting of her grandchildren, because Anna at least kept the blood in the story, and Sylvia erased it entirely. But look closer at what she actually did with the money, and a different reading is possible, one that the final chapters of this film will have to weigh. She did not waste it. She did not leave it to a Henry Hilton to squander, or to a wastrel heir to burn, or to a court to fight over for a generation. She sent it, in 63 careful streams, to hospitals that would heal people, libraries that would teach them, a fire department that would save them, colleges that would lift them. The woman who had let $31 million sit dead and idle in a bank account for decades, doing nothing for anyone, spent her death putting the whole fortune to work at last, for strangers, permanently, in a way her hoarding mother never had. The frugal recluse's final act was the most generous thing anyone in her family had ever done, and she aimed every dollar of it away from the family. Collapse Sylvia Green into a single image, and it is the one the film opened on because her whole life bends toward it. It is the will in the tin cabinet, folded among the cakes of soap. Hold that picture against everything you now know. A fortune of $95 million, the distilled genius and greed of the witch of Wall Street, the money that widows and lawyers and 4 states had gone to war over, the money a sharp old woman had guarded from a witness stand with contempt for everyone who reached for it, and the document that gave every dollar of it away, that ended the family name and endowed 63 strangers forever, had been kept in a tin box next to the soap, because the daughter of Hetty Green could not, even at the end, even in the one grand and generous act of her life, bring herself to spend money on so much as a proper place to keep it. That is the frame of this whole story. A great fortune, a hidden woman, a folded will among the household soap, and a family that opened it expecting their names and found instead the names of strangers. Chapter 14. Where the money went to live. Walk through certain American cities today, and you are walking through these women's decisions, though almost no one knows their names. The fortunes did not vanish. They were not buried with the women who signed them away or dissolved into abstraction. They were poured, deliberately, into stone and brick and bronze and endowment. And a great deal of that stone is still standing, still doing the work these women assigned it, while the women themselves have faded almost entirely out of public memory. That is the strange afterlife of the choice all 4 of them made. The money went on living, in public, useful and visible, under everyone's eyes, and the person who directed it there became a footnote, if that. The buildings survived. The women were erased. It is worth walking the map once, slowly, to see what the strangers actually got. Go down to the harbour of New York, and for many years you could have seen the clearest monument of all, because the city put Sylvia Green Wilks's name on a working fireboat. Her will had left some $3 million to the emergency fund of the fire department, and in 1958, 7 years after her death, the department repaid the gift in the most public way it knew how. It christened a fireboat with her full name, the long chain of family names she had once recited with contempt from a witness stand, and sent the vessel out onto the water to fight fires in the harbour. The woman who had spent 30 years making herself unreachable, who had refused to tell a courtroom so much as her address, had her name painted across the side of a boat and read aloud at a public christening, and carried up and down the rivers of the city she had hidden in. She was findable at last, on the water, and only because she was dead. The fireboat was a real and working vessel, not a plaque, built at a cost of the better part of $1 million, and put into service to fight fires along the crowded waterfront of the city. For decades, it answered alarms on the rivers and in the harbour, throwing arcs of water over burning piers and ships, and every time a crew spoke its name over the radio, they were speaking the long string of names that Sylvia had once recited to a courtroom as an insult, the chain of Howland and Green and Wilks that she had guarded and hidden behind her whole life. She had refused, from the witness stand, to tell strangers where she lived. Her fortune answered by painting her name on a boat and sending it up and down the very rivers of the city she had spent her life avoiding, so that the recluse became, in death, one of the most publicly named women on the water. The gift had been $3 million. The thanks was her name on the harbour for as long as the boat should float. Go north to the coast of Massachusetts, to the city of New Bedford, where the old whaling money had been made and where Sylvia's family had roots, and you find her fortune turned into reading rooms. The more than $1 million she left the public library there, built branch libraries in the neighbourhoods, ordinary places where ordinary people could borrow books, and they carried the family names not as a dynasty, but as a public utility. The Green name and the Wilks name fixed over library doors instead of over a bank. The great hospitals took their share too. Massachusetts General and St. Luke's, wings and endowments funded by a woman none of their patients would ever hear of. Sylvia had scattered herself into the useful institutions of a whole region, and the region absorbed the gifts and, in the way of institutions, forgot the giver. Go inland to Detroit, to the riverfront plaza at the heart of the city, and you find Anna Dodge's decision cast in bronze and moving water. The memorial fountain she funded for the city, a bold modern sculpture by a celebrated artist, still stands on the plaza, still runs, still carries the Dodge name, a gift from the machinist's widow to the city that had made the family rich. And in the city's great art museum, the Detroit Institute of Arts, the furniture of dead French royalty that Anna collected sits behind ropes for the public to look at, the chairs of Marie Antoinette, and the tables fit for a queen, given away rather than fought over, so that a schoolchild in Detroit can stand where a machinist's widow once sat. The palace itself, Rose Terrace, is gone, torn down, vanished. But the fountain runs and the furniture waits, and almost no one who sees them knows the name of the woman who sent them there. Go out onto the Long Island plain, to the town Alexander Stewart began and never finished, the planned community called Garden City, and you find that Cornelia Stewart built her husband a cathedral. The great church at the centre of that town, the Cathedral of the Incarnation, was raised by Cornelia as a memorial to the merchant prince, and it holds his remains, the same remains that were once stolen from a city churchyard and ransomed in the dark. The department store empire is long gone, the name stripped from the Broadway buildings a century ago, but the cathedral stands, and the town stands around it, and the fortune that Henry Hilton could not keep whole nonetheless left, at Cornelia's direction, a spire on the plain that outlasted the business entirely. And down in New Orleans, the gentlest of these monuments goes on doing exactly what a grieving mother built it to do. The college Josephine Newcomb, founded in her dead daughter's name, became part of a great university, and the name Sophie Newcomb is still spoken there, still carved there, still attached to the education of women. More than a century and a half after a 15-year-old girl died of diphtheria, and her mother refused to let the name die with her. Stand back from the whole map, and the pattern is almost unbearable in its irony. Every one of these women had spent a life inside a family and a fortune, and every one of them ended by turning the fortune into something that would outlive the family and forget the woman. The libraries fill with readers who do not know the name over the door. The patients in the hospital wings do not ask who paid for the beds. The crowds at the fountain in Detroit photograph the water and not the woman who bought it. The students at the college in New Orleans learn under a name that belonged to a girl dead at 15 and think nothing of the mother who carved it there. The gifts endure precisely because they were institutional, built to outlast any single person, and the price of that endurance was that the giver dissolved into it. These women bought immortality for their money and anonymity for themselves, and they did it on purpose, and they did it to keep the fortune out of the hands of the people who would have carried their names. That is where the money went to live. A fireboat, a shelf of libraries, a fountain, a cathedral, a college, and behind each of them a woman almost no one remembers, who looked at her own family and chose the stone instead. The relatives who sued are forgotten too, of course. Their arithmetic and their outrage dissolved into old court records. What survived was the gift, and the gift survived precisely because it had been aimed away from the family into institutions built to endure. There is a hard irony in that, and the next chapter has to face it. These women are forgotten, and their money is immortal. And it is immortal for the very reason that they refused to leave it to anyone who might have remembered them. Chapter 15. The Failure or the Only Freedom. Every relative who went to court told the same story, that the old woman had not been in her right mind, because the alternative was harder to say aloud. The alternative was that she had known exactly what she was doing, and had chosen, with full understanding, to leave the family nothing. That is a very difficult thing for a family to say in open court, because it invites the obvious question, the question the whole of this film has been circling. If a competent woman, sane and clear and in command of herself, deliberately leaves her fortune to strangers rather than to her own blood, what does that tell you about the blood? The charge of madness was not only a legal strategy, it was a mercy the families extended to themselves. It let them avoid the harder truth, which was that the woman had weighed them and found them wanting. Line the four of them up one last time, in the order this film has told them, and the escalation is unmistakable. But so is the thread that runs underneath it. Josephine Newcomb, the mildest, left a few million to a college for a daughter 15 years dead, and the nephews called her mad and lost. Cornelia Stewart left half of a far greater fortune to her husband's partner, a blood stranger, and the long-lost relatives surfaced and were dismissed. Anna Dodge, richer than either, looked at 7 grandchildren and cut 3 of them out, and the 3 went to court and lost. And Sylvia Green, richest of all, erased the family entirely, $95 million to 63 institutions, and a token to a cousin who objected and was quieted with a larger token. The sums climb, the coldness climbs, but at every step the shape is identical, a woman with the power to choose, a family that could not accept the choice, and a court that upheld the woman. There is a particular cruelty in the shape of that contest, and it fell on all 4 of these women in death. To break a will, the family could not simply say they wanted the money. They had to prove the woman had been mad or duped or too weak to know her own mind. And so the last public act of each of these lives was a proceeding in which her nearest relatives stood up and described her as incompetent. Josephine Newcomb, who had run a fortune for 35 years, was called an unsound mind. Anna Dodge, sharp to the day she died at 98, had her judgment picked apart by the grandchildren she had cut out. Sylvia Green had already shown a courtroom exactly how clear her mind was, and still a cousin came to object. The women had used the one power the law gave them, and the law's price for defending that power was that their families were invited to prove, in open court, that they had never had a sound mind to exercise. The weapon and the wound came from the same sheet of paper. It is part of why so many of them guarded their privacy so fiercely while they lived. They seem to have known that death would strip it away, and that the fortune they left behind would buy them, along with everything else, one last trial. What unites them is not cruelty, whatever the disappointed relatives believed. It is something closer to judgment, exercised for the first and only time. Remember what these women had been for most of their lives. Cornelia Stewart spent half a century as the wife of a man who exercised all the power for both of them. Anna Dodge lived the first 30 years of her life in poverty, and the next 50 watching money destroy the children it was supposed to bless. Sylvia Green was raised by a mother who taught her that wealth was a wall to hide behind, and she spent her adult life hiding. These were women trained, from girlhood, to have money and not to command it, to be the vessels of fortunes rather than the authors of them. And then, at the very end, each of them found in her hands the one instrument the law would not let a father or a husband or a son override: the will, the single, uncoerced decision. Here is the reversal this whole story has been building toward, and it is worth stating without hedging. Leaving it all to strangers was not the failure of these dynasties. It was the truest thing the dynasties ever produced. Every palace, every settlement, every prenuptial agreement, every allowance doled out to a grown woman as though she were a child, all the machinery that these families built to control their women and preserve their fortunes, produced, at the end of the line, 4 women who used the one freedom left to them to send the fortune out of the family altogether. The relatives saw betrayal. What they were actually looking at was the result of their own arrangements. A family that spends generations treating its women as caretakers of the money should not be surprised when the last caretaker, handed the pen at last, declines to hand the money back to the family. And yet the opposite reading has its own force, and honesty requires giving it room, because these are not simple heroines, and this is not a simple triumph. Something real was lost when these fortunes scattered. A dynasty is not only a machine of control, it is also a continuity, a name carried forward, a set of obligations between the generations, and each of these women, in aiming the fortune away from the blood, chose to end that continuity forever. Sylvia Green could have used $95 million to lift up whatever remained of her family, to give her few cousins and their children a foundation to build centuries on. She chose instead to dissolve the family into charity and let the name die. There were living people, disappointed in those waiting rooms, who were not all villains, who had loved these women or believed they had, and who were told, by the reading of a will, that they counted for less than a hospital they had never entered. The freedom of the woman who signs is also, always, the disinheritance of someone who hoped. That is the knot at the center of every one of these stories, and no court could cut it, because a court could only rule on whether the woman was sane, never on whether she was right. Sanity could be proved. Rightness could not. And so the law did the only thing it could, which was to hand each fortune to the person who had signed for it, and let the moral question fall where it would, on the family, on the strangers, on the memory of the woman, unresolved. Both of those things are true at once, and the courts, which could only rule on sanity, never had to decide between them. So the question this film opened with cannot be closed with a verdict, only with a clearer view of the stakes. Was it the failure of a dynasty, or the last free decision any of these women ever made? The answer depends entirely on where you stand in the room. Stand with the family, and it is a betrayal, a fortune owed and withheld, a name abandoned by the one person entrusted to carry it. Stand with the woman holding the pen, and it is the single moment in a long, controlled life when she got to decide something absolutely. And she decided it for strangers, and the law, for once, took her side against everyone who had ever managed her. The tragedy and the triumph are the same act seen from two chairs, and every viewer of this story will place themselves in one chair or the other, and the placing will say as much about the viewer as about the women. Chapter 16. The Name on the Water. In 1958, 7 years after Sylvia Green Wilks died hiding from the world, the city of New York painted her full name across the side of a fireboat and sent it out onto the harbor. Think about the whole arc that single fact completes. Here was a woman who had spent her life becoming invisible, the daughter of the most notorious rich woman in America, raised in shuttered rooms with the lights turned off, dressed in black, hidden behind agents and lawyers, refusing a courtroom her own address, keeping a fortune of $95 million folded in a tin box next to the soap, because to spend money on its safekeeping was a kind of sin her mother had taught her. She had wanted, more than anything, not to be seen. And in the end, her name was lettered across a working boat and spoken aloud at a public ceremony and carried up and down the rivers of the city, because that was how the strangers she had chosen chose to thank her. To know her in life, you would have had to defeat a lifetime of hiding. You could not have found her house. You could not have gotten her age from her, or her address, or a civil word if you came asking about the money. She dressed in black and kept to her rooms and her dogs and her clippings, and she moved a fortune of $95 million through a bank, while a banker marveled that she let it lie there dead. She had made herself, deliberately and across decades, into a woman almost no one could reach. And then she died, and the wall came down all at once, and her name went out onto the water on the side of a boat, and into the neighborhoods, over the doors of libraries, and onto the wards of hospitals, spoken now by everyone, because she was finally past caring who said it. It is the last irony of a life built entirely out of ironies, that the most private woman of her age became, the moment she died, the most publicly named. That is the circle this story closes, from the tin cabinet in the hook to the boat on the water at the end, and it is the circle all 4 of these women trace in their different ways. They spent their lives inside fortunes that other people had built and other people had controlled. They outlived the men. They reached the end alone, each with a pen and a family in the waiting room. And each of them, given that one uncoerced moment, chose the strangers over the blood and vanished into a footnote while the gift lived on in public without her. The libraries do not carry Sylvia's face. The fountain in Detroit does not tell Anna's story. The cathedral on the Long Island plain does not explain Cornelia, and the college in New Orleans has largely forgotten Josephine, remembering only the daughter whose name she rescued. The money is immortal, and the women are gone, and that is exactly the arrangement they signed. Sit for a moment with how strange a bargain that was. The other 3 vanished, as completely as Sylvia did. Cornelia Stewart is a name almost no one knows, though her husband's cathedral still stands on the Long Island plain and holds the body that was once stolen from its grave. Anna Dodge is a footnote in the history of the city her family's cars helped build, remembered, if at all, as the old woman in the metal bed among the French furniture. Josephine Newcomb is a syllable in the name of a college, eclipsed even there by the daughter whose name she rescued. They had the means to buy any monument they wanted, and each of them spent it on a monument to something other than herself, so that the fortune would speak and the woman would fall silent. That was the arrangement. The gift endures, the giver disappears, and the disappearance was the point. So say plainly, at the end, what all 4 of them did, because they were never allowed to say it plainly themselves. Not one of them left the fortune to a son, because the sons were dead or ruined or had never been born. Not one of them left it whole to the blood that expected it. Not one of them let the family talk her out of it, in life or in court. Josephine left it to a dead girl's name. Cornelia left it to a stranger. Anna left it to the 4 she trusted and struck out the 3 she did not. And Sylvia, last and coldest, and in her cold way most generous, left it to strangers, $95 million of it, to 63 institutions, and not a single soul who bore her name. 4 women, 4 fortunes, 4 rooms full of people doing arithmetic that came out to nothing. The pen was the only power the age ever fully granted them, and every one of them, at the last, used it against the family and for the world. Sylvia Green Wilks spent her whole life refusing to be found, and she left behind exactly 1 line that tells you who she was, delivered from a witness stand to a lawyer who wanted to know where she lived. She would not give him her address. She would not give the court her age, or an inch of her dignity, or a single thing it asked of her. She told them only where the money was, because the money was the one thing she trusted, and the one thing she intended, in the end, to give completely away. "You can find me," she said, "at the bank." She was right. That was where she was, all along, and that was where the fortune waited, until the day she folded her will among the cakes of soap and handed all of it, every dollar, to people she had never met. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Velvet Society, because I have more of these lives, the hidden women and the fortunes they commanded at the very end, waiting to be told. And tell me in the comments, if the fortune had been yours and the family was waiting in the next room, would you have signed it over to strangers, or would you have kept the name alive? I want to read where you land.